The grand ballroom of the Blackwood Manor was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of silk, diamonds, and old money. Crystal chandeliers, heavy as frozen waterfalls, dripped light onto the polished marble floors, where men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than a modest home drifted like elegant, celestial bodies. Laughter, delicate as the clinking of champagne flutes, filled the air, a sound so refined it seemed curated. And in the corner, just beyond the orbit of this glittering cosmos, stood Alara. She was invisible, and that was precisely the point. Her uniform, a stark black dress with a crisp white apron, was designed for invisibility. She was a maid, a ghost meant to glide through the periphery, replenishing drinks and clearing canapés without disrupting the flow of the party. Tonight was the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, hosted by the formidable Mrs. Genevieve Blackwood. Genevieve was a woman sculpted from ice and ambition, her posture as unyielding as her standards. She surveyed her kingdom from the top of the grand staircase, her silver hair coiled into a perfect, severe chignon, her eyes missing nothing. She saw a senator laughing a little too loudly, a misplaced fork on a dessert table, and a faint smudge on a window pane that only she could perceive. Her world was one of immaculate control, and any disruption was not merely an inconvenience, it was a personal affront. Alara had been working at the manor for 6 months. It was grueling work, ruled by the silent terror of Mrs. Blackwood's displeasure. But it paid well, and Alara needed every single dollar. Tucked away in her small apartment, in a worn, velvet-lined case, was her real life. It was a violin, a beautiful, aged instrument of dark, rich wood that had belonged to her mother. Her mother, a woman who had dreamed of concert halls but had been confined to teaching lessons in their small living room, had poured all of her soul into that violin. And when she had passed that soul onto Alara. Every night, after her hands stopped aching from scrubbing floors and polishing silver, Alara would play. She didn't play for an audience. She played for herself, for the memory of her mother, for the dream that still flickered within her, a dream of the National Conservatory, an audition for which was just 3 months, and $2,000 away. Tonight, her job was simple: stay out of the way. She moved with a practiced quietness, her tray of empty glasses a silent companion. As she passed a cluster of guests, their conversation washed over her. "Genevieve has truly outdone herself this year," woman dripping in emerald said. "And I hear she's flown in Maestro Albanelli's top student from Italy to perform." The violinist? He's supposed to be a prodigy. Alara's heart gave a small, envious flutter. To play in a hall like this, for an audience like this, it was the stuff of her most fervent daydreams. She allowed herself a brief, stolen glance at the small, elevated stage at the far end of the room. A single chair and a music stand stood, waiting under a soft spotlight, an island of sacred potential in a sea of opulence. It was then that the first crack appeared in Mrs. Blackwood's perfect universe. A frantic-looking man in a headset, the event coordinator, scurried up to her on the staircase, his face pale. He whispered urgently in her ear. Alara, who was clearing a nearby table, couldn't hear the words, but she saw the effect. The blood drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face. Her iron composure, for a fraction of a second, wavered. She gripped the marble balustrade, her knuckles turning white. The whisper ended. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes blazed with the cold fire. "What do you mean? His flight was cancelled." Her voice was a low, venomous hiss. "An ice storm? In Milan? In May? That is the most pathetic, imbecilic excuse I have ever heard. Find another one, Mrs. Blackwood, at this hour? For an event of this caliber?" The coordinator stammered. "Every notable musician in the city is either here as a guest or booked. It's impossible." "Impossible is a word for lazy people," she seethed, her voice dropping even lower, making it more terrifying. "My guests are expecting a world-class violin performance. My reputation is staked on this night. You will fix this, or you will never work in this city again." The coordinator wilted, scurrying away to make more desperate calls. Mrs. Blackwood descended the stairs, her smile now a brittle, painted-on mask. She moved through her guests, a queen pretending her castle wasn't crumbling. But Alara saw the panic in her eyes, the frantic, darting glances towards the empty stage. The centerpiece of her evening, the jewel in her crown, was missing. Alara's heart began to pound against her ribs. An idea, wild and audacious, sparked in her mind. It was insane. It was unthinkable. She was the maid. She was wallpaper, but the thought wouldn't leave. It was a melody she couldn't unhear. Her mother's face flashed in her memory, the way her eyes would light up when she spoke of music's power to transcend circumstance. Music doesn't care if you're rich or poor, Alara, she used to say. It only asks that you speak its language with an honest heart. She watched as Mrs. Blackwood cornered a distinguished-looking older gentleman with a kind face and a thoughtful expression. Alara recognized him from the newspaper, Mr. Alastair Finch, the lead music critic for the city's top publication and a board member of the very conservatory she dreamed of attending. Alastair, a slight logistical hiccup, Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice dripping with false nonchalance. Our musician has been unavoidably detained. A travel issue. We'll have some lovely recorded music instead. Mr. Finch raised a silver eyebrow. Genevieve, you advertised a live performance by Antonio Rossi. That's quite a hiccup. A shame. I was so looking forward to it. His disappointment was polite but palpable. This was it. It was now or never. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline that was part terror, part resolve. Taking a deep breath, she set her tray down on a vacant table. She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly. She walked, not like a maid, but like a woman with a purpose, directly towards Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Finch. The moment she entered their orbit, the atmosphere chilled. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes, which had been fixed on Mr. Finch, flicked to Alara. The feigned warmth vanished, replaced by sheer unadulterated annoyance. What is it? She snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. Can't you see I'm speaking with a guest? Whatever it is, it can wait. Alara's own voice was quiet, but steady. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Excuse me, Mrs. Blackwood. I overheard about the violinist. Mrs. Blackwood's face twisted into a mask of disbelief. You overheard? Your job is to be deaf and dumb to the conversations of your betters. Now, get back to your duties before I have you thrown out. The sheer venom in her tone made Alara flinch, but she held her ground. Mr. Finch watched the exchange with the quiet, analytical curiosity. I only meant I could help, Alara said, the words feeling small and fragile in the opulent air. Beat of stunned silence. Then, Mrs. Blackwood let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a cruel, ugly sound. You can help. She looked Alara up and down, her gaze lingering on the simple black shoes and the plain apron. And how, precisely, would you help? Are you going to whistle a tune? Perhaps you can juggle the dinner rolls? Don't be absurd. The humiliation was a physical blow. A hot flush crept up Alara's neck. She could feel the eyes of nearby guests turning towards them, their curiosity piqued by the drama. This was a catastrophic mistake. She should have stayed in the shadows, but then she met Mr. Finch's gaze. He wasn't looking at her with pity or amusement. He was looking at her with genuine interest. It was enough. I play, Alara said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I play the violin. The statement hung in the air, so preposterous to Mrs. Blackwood that for a moment, she was speechless. Then, her fury returned, tenfold. This wasn't just an interruption anymore. It was an act of insubordination, a mockery of her entire world. Order. The maid was claiming to possess the talent of an artist. That is enough, she said, her voice low and trembling with rage. You are fired. Pack your things and get out of my house. Now. Security, she called out, her voice ringing through the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area. Guests were openly staring now, their champagne flutes paused halfway to their lips. This was better than a string quartet. This was a spectacle. A young black maid, dressed in a servant's uniform, being publicly cast out by the city's most powerful hostess. But before the security guards could converge, Mr. Finch spoke. His voice was calm and carried an authority that even Mrs. Blackwood could not easily dismiss. "One moment, Genevieve," he said, placing a gentle, restraining hand on her arm. He turned his full attention to Elara. His eyes were kind but sharp, searching for something. "You play the violin?" Elara nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and shame. "And you believe you can play for this audience?" he continued, his tone even. I believe so, sir," she whispered. Mrs. Blackwood tried to pull her arm away. "Alistair, have you lost your mind? This is a servant. She's probably plucked a few strings on some cheap fiddle. She's making a fool of me, all of us. This is my gala, and it's a gala without a musician," Mr. Finch countered smoothly, his gaze never leaving Elara. "You have an audience of the city's most influential patrons, and an empty stage. What, exactly, do you have to lose by letting her play one song?" He paused, a glint in his eye. "Unless, of course, you're afraid. Afraid that a maid, as you call her, might actually have talent. What would that say about all this?" He made a sweeping gesture at the room, the gowns, the jewels, the carefully constructed facade of superiority. The challenge was laid. Mrs. Blackwood was trapped. To refuse now would be to admit fear, to admit that her world, built on exclusion and status, was so fragile it could be threatened by a girl in an apron. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions, fury, pride, and a new, creeping sense of being outmaneuvered. She glared at Elara, her eyes filled with the promise of retribution. "Fine," she spat the word out like poison. "Fine, let the maid play. Let's all have a good laugh before we send her on her way." She turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, a slight change in our program. It seems we have some unexpected local talent in our midst. Let's give her our attention." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. Some smirked, others looked on with pity. Elara felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. This was no longer just about playing. It was a trial. Mr. Finch gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Do you have your instrument with you?" Elara's heart sank. "It's at my apartment." A triumphant, cruel smile flashed across Mrs. Blackwood's face. "Oh, what a pity. I suppose that's the end of that." "Not at all," Mr. Finch said calmly. He signaled to Mrs. Blackwood's personal driver, who stood by the door. "Thomas, you will drive this young lady to her home and back, as quickly and safely as possible. We will wait." He said it not as a request, but as a command. Mrs. Blackwood was rendered speechless. The critic had taken control. Defeated, for the moment, she could only watch as Elara, escorted by the driver, was led out of the grand ballroom, the murmur of the crowd following her like a wave. The drive was a blur. Elara sat in the back of the plush sedan, her mind racing. What was she doing? She was going to return to that room of vipers and bare her soul. She ran up the 3 flights of stairs to her cramped apartment, her hands fumbling with the keys. There it was, her mother's violin case, sitting on her bed like a patient friend. She grabbed it, her hands now steady. As she held the cool leather handle, a sense of calm washed over the terror. This was not about them. It was not about Mrs. Blackwood or the condescending guests. It was about her mother. It was about the music. It was about the truth. When she returned to the manor, the atmosphere in the ballroom was thick with anticipation and skepticism. She walked through the parted crowd, no longer a ghost, but the undeniable center of attention. She didn't look at the faces. She looked only at the stage. As she walked, she unbuttoned and removed the white apron, folding it neatly and placing it on an empty chair. She was no longer a maid. She was a musician. She stepped onto the stage and sat on the lone chair. The soft spotlight felt warm on her skin. She opened the case, the worn velvet interior of familiar comfort. She lifted the violin, its dark wood gleaming. It felt like an extension of her own body. She ran the bow across a block of rosin, the soft, scratching sound, the only noise in the cavernous, silent room. She took a moment, closed her eyes, and breathed. She didn't see the gala. She saw her mother, sitting in their small living room, smiling. "Play from your heart, Elara. It will never lie," she opened her eyes. She looked out, not at the crowd, but through them. She saw Mrs. Blackwood, standing near the front, her arms crossed, her face a mask of smug certainty, waiting for the failure. She saw Mr. Finch, his expression one of intense, hopeful focus. Then, she drew the bow across the strings. The first note was not loud, but it was pure. It hung in the air, a single, perfect teardrop of sound that cut through the silence. It was a note of such profound melancholy, such deep, resonant sorrow, that a collective breath was held across the room. The smirks began to falter. Lara didn't play a familiar classical piece, a showy, technical exercise designed to impress. She played something else. She played her own story. The music began with a low, mournful melody that spoke of hardship, of long hours and aching hands, of feeling invisible and overlooked. It was the sound of her life at the manor, the quiet dignity of her labor, the loneliness of the servants' quarters. Then, the tempo quickened. The notes began to climb, to dance, to fight. It was the sound of her spirit refusing to be broken, the secret joy she found in her small apartment at the end of an exhausting day. It was the melody of her mother's lessons, filled with laughter and love, a theme of warmth and light woven into the darker tapestry. Her fingers flew across the fingerboard, a blur of motion. The music swelled, filling every corner of the vast ballroom. It was no longer just a violin. It was a voice, crying out with a passion that was raw, untamed, and utterly undeniable. The guests were no longer guests. They were listeners, captivated. The senator had stopped laughing. The woman in emeralds had a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Champagne flutes were forgotten on tables. All the pretense, all the posturing of the evening, had been stripped away by the sheer, unvarnished honesty of the music. It spoke a language older and more powerful than money or status. Alara's gaze found Mrs. Blackwood. The smugness was gone from her face. It had been replaced by a stunning, horrifying realization. This wasn't the clumsy fumbling of a servant. This was artistry. This was genius. The music that filled her perfect ballroom, the music that held every one of her powerful guests spellbound, was coming from the hands of the girl she had tried to throw into the street. The girl she had called a nobody. The foundation of Genevieve Blackwood's world, the belief in her own inherent superiority, was cracking under the weight of every perfect note. Her face was pale, her expression one of utter, public defeat. The humiliation she had intended for Alara had turned back on her, 100-fold. The music reached its crescendo, a soaring, triumphant passage that spoke of hope, of dreams taking flight, of a spirit unshackled. It was a declaration of worth, a cry of "I am here," that reverberated off the gilded ceilings and shook the crystal chandeliers. And then, as beautifully as it began, it softened. The final notes were gentle, like a feather landing, a whisper of peace and forgiveness. The last note faded into a silence so profound it felt sacred. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The entire room was frozen, suspended in the echo of that final note. Then, one person began to clap. It was Mr. Alistair Finch. He was on his feet, his face filled with an emotion that went beyond appreciation. It was awe. His solitary clapping was quickly joined by another, then another, until the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous, roaring ovation. It wasn't polite applause. It was a spontaneous, overwhelming outpouring of emotion. People were on their feet, shouting bravo, their faces wet with tears they didn't understand. They weren't just clapping for the music. They were clapping for the story they had just witnessed, the triumph of soul over circumstance. Alara sat on the stage, the violin held loosely in her lap, tears streaming down her own face. They were tears of release, of validation, grief, and of overwhelming joy. She had done it. She had spoken her truth. Mr. Finch was the first to reach the stage. He took her hand, his eyes shining. "Young lady," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "in all my years as a critic, I have rarely been so moved. That was not a performance. That was a revelation. What is your name?" "Alara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Alara Vance." "Alara Vance," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. The audition for the National Conservatory is in 3 months. That is a formality. I am on the board. A full scholarship is yours. We would be fools not to have you. The words hit Alara with the force of a physical wave. A full scholarship. The dream she had been scrubbing floors and polishing silver for, the dream that had felt a world away, was now here, being handed to her. Other guests surged forward. Powerful, wealthy people who, an hour ago, wouldn't have given her a second glance. They crowded around her, offering compliments, business cards, promises of patronage. She was no longer invisible. She was the brightest star in the room. Across the sea of admirers, she saw Mrs. Genevieve Blackwood. She stood alone, isolated. In the middle of her own party, her guests had abandoned her, drawn to the new center of gravity. Her face was a ruin. She looked old and small and utterly powerless. She tried to compose herself, to approach Alara, perhaps to offer some hollow, self-serving apology, to try and claim a sliver of this victory as her own. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed by the magnitude of her misjudgment. The gala she had orchestrated to cement her status had become the stage for her public undoing, all because she couldn't see the queen hiding in the guise of a pawn. Alara met her gaze one last time. There was no hatred in her eyes, no triumph, only a quiet, profound pity. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a final acknowledgement, before turning her attention back to Mr. Finch, back to her future. She didn't need to say a word. Her music had said it all. She had won, not by stooping to Mrs. Blackwood's level, but by rising so far above it that she simply left her behind. The truth is that value is not determined by the uniform you wear or the title you hold. True worth is a fire carried within the soul, a light that cannot be extinguished by scorn or arrogance. It is a quiet melody waiting for its moment to be played. The world is full of those who judge the book by its cover, who mistake humility for weakness and silence for absence. But every so often, the cover is ripped away, revealing a story so powerful it changes the room, and everyone in it. The most profound justice is not loud and vengeful, but the quiet, undeniable triumph of truth over privilege. For more stories that uncover the hidden power within the underestimated and celebrate the moment truth speaks to power, subscribe to our channel and join a community that believes in the light that shines in unexpected places.